Hi, I'm Achyuta. I'm a class of 24 Caroline D. Bradley Scholar, and in this video series we'll be talking about cryptography. But what is cryptography? I'm glad you asked. Cryptography is the study of secrecy, or more specifically hidden writing, because if you can see as the word, crypt plus graph is hidden plus to write. And cryptography requires three elements. It requires the plain text, which is what you want to encrypt, what you don't want the person seeing. The key, which is the key is kind of like the piece of information you need to convert the plain text into the ciphertext and the ciphertext back to plain text in some cases. So the key is kind of like the secret pulsar. It's like a key to a box, right? That's why it's called the key. Like, the contents of the box here would be the plain text. The lock on it would be the encryption method, and the whole box itself would be the ciphertext here. And the ciphertext is what actually gets sent, and it's the encrypted message. Basically, the idea is if someone sees the ciphertext, under no circumstances they should be able to get back the plain text, unless they have access to the key. Within reason, of course, because if someone can brute force the key, they can obviously get the plain text back by way of decryption. And that's why keys tend to be quite long, so there's a large thing called a key space, which is a list of all the possible keys. So if someone tries to brute force the key, it would take a very long while. So this is a video series after all, but what we will speak about today is the history of cryptography up to the Enigma machine and World War II, which really marks the beginning of modern cryptography. The first real incidences of cryptography in history were called substitution ciphers, and their entire premise was you're substituting a letter for a different letter, and there's some sort of lookup table where you would change that letter from A maybe to X. And the more simple type, the simpler type, is called a monoalphabetic substitution cipher because there's one alphabet. There's one table that you're substituting with, and it came first by way of the Caesar cipher, which used another letter conversion table, which for the Caesar cipher, it's a shift, where you would say most common shift would be by 3. So as you can see down below, A would map to D, B would map to E, C would map to F, D would map to G, and X would map to A, and so on and so forth. So if you had the sentence, hello world, you can encrypt it very simply by being H goes to K, so K, E goes to H, so H, and so on and so forth, and you reach this Kurzorg, which isn't an English phrase. It's nothing like hello world. Without any tools, you won't be able to get hello world from Kurzorg. And the key here, the plain text obviously is the plain text, so hello world. The ciphertext is Kurzorg, and the key here would just be the shift you used. So for this one specifically, there would be a shift of 3, because if you number them 1, 2, 3, 4, you added 3 to A to get to D. Okay. So Caesar used this to hide battle plans and other information, and for his use, it worked out pretty well, but in the modern era, you can't really use substitution ciphers, especially not monoalphabetic ones, because, for example, the Caesar cipher, you can brute force the key. There's only 26 possibilities, which is ridiculously small, especially with computers being able to do hundreds of or thousands of computations in a second. Another thing that's super useful for cracking these kinds of monoalphabetic substitution ciphers is something called FA, or frequency analysis, which basically looks at the frequency of how the letters that appear. It works more for longer text than shorter text. Like, you wouldn't want to do frequency analysis with this 2-word phrase. You might want to use a more brute force type method. But with frequency analysis, it relies on the fact that English letters in English words, they appear with different frequencies. Like, E is the most common word, then A, and so on. So if you see the most common letter in a text is H, and it's a very long text, you can guess that H maps to E, and then use the shift that it would take to make H maps to E, and then test it. And if you get something that makes sense, you've cracked the code. And this was a lot more efficient than brute forcing because it relies on this more information. And this entirely cripples any type of monoalphabetic substitution cipher. So, advancing security, now we're going to talk about the next steps from the Caesar cipher, because history quickly realized that the Caesar cipher simply wasn't good enough for most purposes, because obviously things like frequency analysis. So the next real class of historical cryptography was, with the Vigenère cipher in general, these polyalphabetic substitution ciphers. And the most famous one, of course, was this cipher right here. And it was invented in 1553 and broken in 1863, so it had a pretty solid run of like 310 years before it was fully broken for everyone and proven insecure for modern use. And it uses something called a Vigenère square, which is illustrated right here, and instead of having a very standard key number like the Caesar cipher would with its shift, it has something called a keyword, which your keyword being a something. So say we want to encrypt the message hello with keyword hi. So the first thing we do would repeat hi over and over again. Hello is 5 letters, so it would be hi H. H-I-H-I-H. So then the first letter here, we'd go to H, and then we'd encrypt the first letter of hello with the shift of H. With the first, basically the shift of H being the first letter is H. So then the first letter in encryption would be O. And the second bit, it would be E, and that would be encrypted instead of H, like would be a substitution cipher, a Caesar cipher, it would be encrypted with I, because I is the next letter in our keyword. So we'd have H is O, E is N, then we go back to H for L, L is T, and then this is the trick with the Vigenère cipher, because the Caesar cipher in very standard frequency analysis relies on the fact that if I have a letter in the plain text, that letter in the cipher text will be the same. If there's if there's 2 of the same letter in the cipher text, that means 2 of the same letter in the plain text. But the trick with the Vigenère cipher is because we have this keyword, our first L here, that's why I chose hello, because it has these 2 L's, our first L would be encrypted with H, so it would come out as S, but the second L would be encrypted with I, so it would come out of T, breaking standard frequency analysis and actually fully immune to just bare bones trying to run frequency analysis with most margins. But it has a few problems with it in that the keyword, I'm repeating the keyword throughout the entire thing. I'm not using new random information there. There's information being stored about the key. And that repeating nature means once the key length is found, it can be easily broken because it can treat it as interweaving Caesar ciphers. Say I knew that my key is just 2 letters long, which is pretty short for a key. But for that short letter, I know that the first letter of the message, H, the third letter of the message, L, the last letter of the message, O, H, L, and O, are all encrypted using the same shift. And using that, you can run frequency analysis using that. And there's actually a nice story about this, which was someone named Thwaites, a engineer, is talking about how he invented a new form of cryptography, and it's a new cipher, and it's completely unbreakable. And Charles Babbage, who's another influential figure of the era, he wanted to show that Thwaites' cipher is just a version of the Vigenère cipher. So Thwaites gave him some passages that are encrypted with it, and using techniques such as these, Babbage was able to decrypt the message without ever knowing the key, and perform this cryptanalysis to show that the Vigenère cipher wasn't very secure at all. And there are mathematical processes, such as the Friedman test, which can be used to find this key length and get good estimates of it. While having some sort of brute force calculation for it can work, the Friedman test is obviously better. So after the Vigenère cipher, we get to 1882, where the one-time pad is created. It was also called the Vernon cipher at the time. And this cipher actually achieves something called perfect secrecy, where there's no way to find the plain text from the ciphertext, and there's no way to get more information out of it other than simply brute forcing the ciphertext. So one thing that is the Verdun cipher specifically very much relies on the XOR gate, and many other elements of cryptography use this gate as well. And the best way to explain the XOR gate is that it's simply binary addition modulo 2. So what that means is that, for example, if 0 plus 1 mod 2 is 1, 0 plus 0 mod 2 is 0, 1 plus 1 mod 2 is 0. So you take that, you take whatever your string is, whatever your text is in letters, and you can encode that to a binary string using many known methods, including things like UTF-8. So then you'd have this plain text, and then you can XOR that with the secret key, and then you'd get the ciphertext. And to decrypt, as it says right here, you take the ciphertext and XOR it with the secret key again, and you'd have the plain text. This gives you perfect secrecy, but there's a big cost to using the one-time pad, and that's why it doesn't see very much use nowadays. We use more modern techniques, which are technically less secure, but it's a sacrifice we have to make. The first flaw would be the fact that it's called a one-time pad for a reason. You can only use each key once, because if someone has two plain text given with the same key, right, they have two plain text that are encrypted using the same key, they can XOR them together and retrieve the XOR of the two plain text. And there are tools based off the English language and human language specifically to get back the original plain text, or get back a lot of information about the original plain text. So that's very insecure, so you have to use each key once, which is a bit of a pain. A different problem is the biggest problem, really, something which has to do with the key size. For this, the key size has to be identical to the plaintext size. And the problem here is with key distribution. You have to give someone the key. And you have to send that across some sort of secure channel, where it would make sense if you have that secure channel that can send in information that's as big as the plaintext. Why didn't you just send the plaintext in the first place across that secure channel? There's been ways to circumvent this, like the US-Russia hotline. They use massive books, which have tons and tons and tons of random numbers that are used for one-time pads. But in most cases, we don't need perfect security. We need good enough security, which is where the notion of semantic security comes in. And also, it was proven mathematically that the only way to achieve perfect secrecy is with a key size that's identical to the size of the plaintext. So really, perfect secrecy is a wonderful notion to have, but it's not that useful. And that's why cryptography has continued to advance since the one-time pad. Finally, today we'll be talking about the Enigma cipher, which from a cryptographic standpoint, it isn't too notable. It's only notable for having its massive key space. And but at heart, it's really just another polyalphabetic substitution cipher. But the thing is, it's very notable historically because its significance in the World War II. It is said that the cracking Enigma either speeded the end of World War II or turned the tide for the Allied forces. And to illustrate how the Enigma works, it uses two pieces. It uses the rotor and the plug board. The plug board is just a very simple substitution cipher, where if, say, A and D are connected on the plug board, here S and D, but we'll go with A and D, any input that's A would be shown as D, and any input as D shown as A. This creates a very large key size, and it's relatively simple to implement as well. So that's why it's there, just to increase the key space quite a bit. But the interesting bit is these rotors right here. There's connection of 5 rotors with, I think there were 6 or 7 rotors total, and you can swap in rotors. There are drop-in replacements. And the idea of rotors is that they have all these crisscross electrical components in connections inside of them. And every time you type a letter, it would go through these rotors, then go back again through the rotors, which obviously would create some form of encryption for that letter, because these rotor positions are random and actually get changed every single time someone types in a character, starting with this rotor, then this one, then this one, then this one. So since all the rotors are changing, the probabilities multiply, and it's a truly immense key space. You're never going to try and brute force a cipher like the Enigma. And the techniques used to solve it were a lot more modern. And that's why, with those techniques being so modern, those tools of cryptanalysis, it really ushered in the era of modern cryptography, because with such strong tools, we needed stronger ciphers to be able to work against those tools. And that era of modern cryptography will be covered in the next video in this series. So thank you guys for watching.